The streetlights cast long shadows across Stony Island Avenue as a taxi slowed to a stop in front of a red-brick two-story house. Inside, Staff Sergeant Joe Benson exhaled, tired yet alert, his eyes taking in the familiar exterior. It was 2:17 a.m. on a humid July morning, and the street was unnervingly quiet. After 15 months in Iraq, all he wanted was to surprise his wife, Ruby, and hold her close again. He wasn't officially due home for another 3 weeks. The early return was his gift. Their 10th anniversary was just days away. In his duffel bag, alongside his combat fatigues and dog tags, lay a gold necklace he had specially ordered from Dubai. The cab driver, an elderly man named Pete, helped him with his luggage. Pete welcomed him home, refusing the extra tip Joe offered. He told Joe his family must be thrilled to have him back. Joe smiled at the thought of Ruby's reaction. She didn't know he was coming, he thought. Pete nodded to say goodbye, returned to his cab, and drove off into the night. Joe paused outside his house. Something felt off. A car he didn't recognize, a black Chrysler 300 with tinted windows and custom rims, was parked in front. Probably a neighbor's new ride, he told himself. Yet a knot tightened in his stomach. The house was dark, save for a faint glow from their bedroom upstairs. The porch light, always left on by Ruby, was off. As he drew closer, more small details seemed wrong. The front garden, once meticulously maintained by Ruby, looked neglected. Empty beer bottles lined the porch railing. Using his key, Joe quietly opened the front door. The living room smelled strange, a mix of cologne and marijuana smoke. Their wedding photo, normally standing on the entry table, lay face down. Then he heard it, muffled sounds coming from upstairs. Joe's military training kicked in automatically. Moving silently, he set down his bags and climbed the stairs, each step calculated and quiet. The sounds grew clearer, rhythmic creaking, heavy breathing, a man's low grunt. The master bedroom door was closed but not fully latched. Yellow light spilled through the crack along with the unmistakable sounds of sex. Joe felt his world tilt sideways, but his body moved with the calm precision that had kept him alive in combat. He pushed the door open. The scene burned itself into his mind in fragments, tangled sheets, brown skin against brown skin, his wife's legs wrapped around a stranger's waist. Their wedding picture on the nightstand watched it all. Time seemed to stop. Nobody moved. Then Ruby screamed. The man, muscular with dreadlocks and a tribal tattoo across his back, rolled off and reached for something on the floor. In the yellow lamplight, metal glinted. A gun. Joe's training took over. In Iraq, hesitation meant death. He crossed the room in 2 steps, caught the man's wrist before he could raise the weapon, and drove his other fist into the man's throat. The gun clattered to the floor. What happened next played out like a horrible dream. Ruby screaming, the man gasping for air but swinging, fists connecting with flesh, rolling on the floor, the gun sliding under the bed, blood spraying across white walls. In the chaos, the man's hand found the gun. He lunged. 2 shots rang out. 2 shots rang out. Then silence. The man collapsed backward, crimson blooming across his chest. His eyes went wide with shock, then empty. He crumpled to the floor beside the bed, the gun slipping from his fingers. Ruby's screaming stopped. She pressed herself against the headboard, sheets clutched to her chest, her eyes locked on the body, then on Joe. Joe stood there, breathing hard, blood on his knuckles, his uniform. For a moment, neither of them moved. The yellow lamplight cast harsh shadows across the room, the smell of gunpowder mixed with cologne and sweat. Ruby's voice came out as a whisper, barely audible. She spoke his name, just his name. A question, a plea, terror in her eyes. Joe looked at her, really looked at her. The woman he'd dreamed about every night for 15 months. The woman whose letters he'd read by flashlight in his tent. The woman he'd almost died for. The woman who'd just been in bed with another man. In their bed. On their anniversary week. Joe bent down and picked up the gun. His hand was steady. Too steady. The kind of steady that comes after you've crossed a line you can never uncross. Ruby started to speak, words tumbling out in a desperate rush. She was sorry, so sorry, it was a mistake. She loved him. Please, please, Joe, please don't. Joe raised the gun. Ruby's pleas turned to screams, but they sounded distant, like they were coming from underwater. Joe's ears were still ringing from the first shots. Everything felt surreal, dreamlike, like he was watching himself from outside his body. He thought about the letters she'd sent. I miss you so much, counting down the days until you're home. I love you, baby, stay safe. He thought about the gold necklace in his duffel bag downstairs, their initials engraved on the back. He thought about 10 years of marriage, 10 years of promises. And he thought about the last 15 months, roadside bombs, firefights, watching his brothers die in the sand, all while His finger moved to the trigger. Ruby's body jerked once, then went still. The screaming stopped. The room fell into a terrible, absolute silence. Joe stood there, gun still raised, staring at what he'd done, at what they'd made him do. The ringing in his ears faded slowly. Reality crashed back in waves. 2 bodies, blood on the walls, the smell of death mixing with the smell of betrayal. Joe lowered the gun. His hands started to shake, not from fear, but from the adrenaline finally releasing its grip. He looked down at himself. Blood spattered across his uniform, the same uniform he'd worn with pride, the same uniform he'd almost been buried in. He walked to the nightstand, stepping over the man's body, and picked up their wedding photo. He stared at it for a long moment. 2 young people, smiling in love with their whole lives ahead of them. He set it face down. Joe pulled out his phone. His fingers moved mechanically, muscle memory taking over where his mind had gone blank. He dialed 911. The dispatcher answered, her voice professional and calm, asking about his emergency. Joe's voice came out flat, emotionless. He gave his address, told her there had been a shooting, 2 people dead, he was the shooter, he would be waiting outside. The dispatcher's voice changed, became more urgent. She asked if he was injured, if there was an immediate threat, if he still had the weapon. Joe answered each question with mechanical precision. No, yes, but he would set it down before the police arrived. He wasn't a threat. He was a soldier. He knew the protocol. The dispatcher tried to keep him on the line, but Joe ended the call. He wiped the gun clean with a corner of the bedsheet, force of habit, though it didn't matter now, and set it carefully on the dresser. He took one last look at the room, at Ruby, at the man whose name he didn't even know, at the shattered remains of his life. Then he walked out, closing the door behind him. He went downstairs, stepping over his duffel bag still by the front door, the gold necklace inside, the carefully folded uniform, the dog tags that had survived a war. He walked outside and sat down on the porch steps, the same steps he'd climbed with hope in his heart less than 20 minutes ago. The neighborhood was still quiet, still dark. The streetlights still cast long shadows. Nothing had changed out here. Everything had changed in there. Joe sat with his hands on his knees, breathing slowly, staring at nothing, waiting. The sirens started far away, growing gradually louder. Red and blue lights began to paint the quiet residential street. 1 patrol car, then 2, then 4. Officers emerged with weapons drawn, shouting commands. Joe didn't move. He kept his hands visible on his knees and didn't resist as they swarmed him. Cold metal handcuffs clicked around his wrists. They asked him where the weapon was, if there was anyone else inside, if the scene was secure. Joe answered every question in that same flat, emotionless tone. The weapon was upstairs on the dresser, 2 deceased upstairs in the master bedroom, no one else in the house. The scene was secure. They sat him in the back of a patrol car while other officers entered his house, weapons ready. Joe watched through the window as more units arrived. An ambulance, a sergeant's vehicle, the medical examiner's van. Neighbors started emerging from their houses, drawn by the lights and sirens. Mrs. Chen from next door in her bathrobe. The Martinez family from across the street, all of them staring, whispering, pointing. Joe didn't look at them. He stared straight ahead at nothing. A detective arrived. A black woman in her 40s, Detective Sarah Washington, her badge clipped to her belt. She opened the patrol car door and crouched down to Joe's eye level. She introduced herself, then asked if he understood his rights. Joe nodded. Yes, he understood. He'd been read his rights before during training. He knew the drill. She asked if he wanted to tell her what happened. Joe's voice finally cracked as he spoke. He told her he'd just come home from deployment. 15 months in Iraq. Came home early to surprise his wife. Found her with another man. The man pulled a gun. They fought. The gun went off. The detective listened, writing in her notebook. She asked about the second victim. Joe went quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He said he didn't know. He didn't remember. Everything went blank after the first shots. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Detective Washington closed her notebook. She told him they'd continue this conversation at the station. She asked if he needed medical attention. Joe shook his head. He wasn't the one who needed medical attention. She closed the door. Joe sat in the back of the patrol car, handcuffed, watching officers come and go from his house, from his home, from the place that was supposed to be his safe haven after surviving a war. The medical examiner's team brought out the first body bag, then the second. Joe closed his eyes. The patrol car finally pulled away from Stony Island Avenue. Through the rear window, Joe watched his house disappear into the distance. Yellow crime scene tape was already going up. Neighbors were still gathered, watching, talking. Joe opened his eyes and stared at the metal grate separating him from the officers in the front seat, at the door handles that didn't work from the inside, at the smears of dried blood on his hands. Staff Sergeant Joe Benson had survived 15 months in Iraq, survived roadside bombs and ambushes and the scorching desert heat. He'd come home a hero, and in less than an hour he'd become a murderer. The station loomed ahead, all concrete and fluorescent lights. The patrol car pulled into the sally port, the secure garage where they brought in suspects. The door rolled down behind them, sealing Joe inside. This was just the beginning. Joe spent the night in a holding cell, concrete walls, metal bench, fluorescent lights that never turned off. He didn't sleep, didn't try to. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same thing, Ruby's face in that final moment, the yellow lamplight, the gun in his hand. Other inmates came and went through the night, drunk drivers, drug dealers, men who'd gotten into bar fights. They gave Joe a wide berth. Maybe it was something in his eyes. Maybe it was the dried blood still on his hands that the processing hadn't quite scrubbed away. Around 6 a.m., a guard brought him a tray of food, powdered eggs, toast, watery coffee. Joe stared at it but didn't touch it. He wasn't hungry, wasn't sure he'd ever be hungry again. At 7:30, the cell door opened. Detective Washington stood there looking like she'd been up all night too, but her eyes were sharp, alert. She told him to come with her. They walked through narrow corridors past other cells into an interrogation room. Gray walls, the metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, a camera in the corner, its red light blinking. Detective Washington sat across from him. She set down a manila folder, thick with papers, and a cup of coffee. She slid the coffee across to Joe. She asked if he'd slept. Joe shook his head. She asked if he wanted a lawyer. Joe said he didn't know. Did he need one? Detective Washington studied him for a long moment. Then she opened the folder and pulled out several photographs, crime scene photos. She laid them out on the table, one by one. The bedroom, the blood, the body of the man later identified as Marcus Deshaun Williams, 28, a personal trainer with a record for possession and assault, and Ruby. But something in Detective Washington's expression had changed. She told Joe there had been a development, a significant development. Joe looked up from the photos, meeting her eyes. She leaned back in her chair and delivered the news that would change everything. Ruby was alive. Joe's face went blank. He asked her to repeat that. Detective Washington explained. The bullet had entered Ruby's upper left shoulder, missing her heart by inches. She'd lost a lot of blood, critical amounts, but the paramedics had gotten there in time. She'd been rushed to Cook County Hospital, emergency surgery, touch and go through the night. But as of 6:45 this morning, Ruby Benson was alive, stable and conscious. Joe sat perfectly still. He didn't know what to feel, relief, horror, both, neither. Detective Washington continued. Ruby had given a preliminary statement from her hospital bed, and that statement had opened up a whole new investigation. She pulled out another document, a transcript. She began to read. According to Ruby, the man, Marcus, wasn't just some random affair. He was her dealer, had been for the past 6 months. She'd gotten into prescription pills after Joe deployed, then graduated to harder things when the prescriptions ran out. Marcus had been supplying her. The affair was part of the payment arrangement. But there was more. Ruby claimed that Marcus had become violent in recent weeks, possessive. When she tried to end things, Marcus had threatened her, threatened to hurt her, hurt Joe. He'd shown up that night uninvited, forced his way in. She'd been trying to placate him when Joe arrived. The gun, Marcus's gun, had been pointed at Ruby first, not at Joe. Ruby claimed Marcus had planned to kill them both, that Joe had saved her life. Detective Washington set down the transcript and looked at Joe. She asked if any of that was true. Joe's mind raced. He thought back to the moment, the chaos, the fear in Ruby's eyes. Had that been fear of Marcus or fear of him? The gun on the floor, had Marcus been reaching for it to shoot Ruby or to defend himself? Everything had happened so fast. Joe told the detective he didn't know. He'd seen the gun, seen the threat. His training took over. Everything after that was a blur of violence and adrenaline. Detective Washington made notes. She asked about the second shot, the one that hit Ruby. What did he remember about that? Joe went quiet. This was the moment. The line between self-defense and murder, between going home eventually and spending life in prison. He could lie, say it was an accident in the struggle, say Marcus grabbed his hand and the gun went off. Ruby's statement could support that. Or he could tell the truth. Joe looked down at his hands, hands that had held a rifle, hands that had saved lives in Iraq, hands that had pulled a trigger in his own bedroom. He told Detective Washington the truth. He'd shot Ruby deliberately. In that moment, consumed by rage and betrayal, he'd made the choice. It wasn't an accident, wasn't Marcus, it was him. Detective Washington stopped writing. She set down her pen and looked at him for a long time. She asked him if he understood what he just confessed to. Attempted murder, possibly first degree if the prosecutor could prove premeditation. Joe nodded. He understood. She closed her folder. She told him that Ruby's statement painted a very different picture, a picture where Joe was a victim, a decorated soldier who'd come home to find his wife in danger, who'd acted to protect her, whose weapon had accidentally discharged in the struggle. A picture where Joe walked away. But Joe had just contradicted that entire narrative. Detective Washington asked him why. Why throw away his chance at freedom? Why not take the way out that Ruby was offering him? Joe's voice was quiet but firm. He said because it wasn't true. He'd done what he'd done. He wasn't going to lie about it. He'd spent 15 months watching men die. Good men. Honest men. He owed them more than to start his life back home with a lie. Detective Washington studied him. Then she did something unexpected. She told him she respected that. Not many people in his position would make that choice. But respect didn't change the law. She stood up and told him she'd be recommending charges. Attempted murder for Ruby. Second-degree murder for Marcus, since the self-defense claim was complicated by the second shooting. The district attorney would make the final call. She gathered her folder and turned to leave, but at the door she paused. She told Joe that Ruby had asked about him, asked if he was okay, asked if she could see him. Joe looked up. He asked what the detective had told her. Detective Washington said she'd told Ruby that Joe was in custody and wouldn't be seeing visitors, but she'd also told Ruby something else. She told Ruby that her husband had just given up his freedom to tell the truth about what he'd done. The detective left. The door closed. Joe sat alone in the interrogation room, staring at the crime scene photos still spread across the table. Hours passed. Joe was processed, fingerprinted again, and photographed. His personal effects were cataloged and stored. The bloody uniform was taken as evidence. He was given Orange County Jail scrubs that smelled like industrial detergent. He was assigned to a cell in the general population, not protective custody, despite being a soldier. The guards watched him carefully. Word had already spread about the case. War hero, cheating wife, crime of passion, the kind of story that made headlines. That afternoon, Joe got his first visitor. Not a lawyer, not family, his parents were both dead, no siblings. Not Ruby, who was still in the hospital under guard. It was Pete, the cab driver. Joe was escorted to the visitor's room, plexiglass dividers, phones on either side, rows of other inmates talking to their families, their lawyers, their friends. Pete sat on the other side of the glass, still wearing his cab driver's cap. His kind eyes looked sad, disappointed, but not angry. Joe picked up the phone on his side. Pete did the same. Pete spoke first. He said he'd seen the news, recognized the address, recognized Joe from the photo they were showing. He'd had to come see for himself. Joe didn't know what to say. He apologized, said Pete shouldn't have gotten involved, shouldn't have come. Pete shook his head. He said he'd been driving that cab for 30 years, picked up thousands of people, soldiers coming home, parents visiting sick kids, people starting new lives, people ending old ones. He said he'd learned to read people, and when he'd picked Joe up at the airport, he'd seen a good man, tired, worn down, but good. Pete asked what happened, not the details the news was reporting, what really happened. Joe hesitated. Then slowly he told the story, all of it, the discovery, the fight, the choice he'd made, the shot he'd fired at Ruby, the truth he'd told the detective. When he finished, Pete was quiet for a long time. Then he asked a simple question. Did Joe regret telling the truth? Joe thought about it, about the offer Detective Washington had implied, about the life he could have had if he'd taken Ruby's version of events, self-defense, accident, freedom. Joe said no. He didn't regret it. He'd spent 15 months in Iraq learning what honor meant, learning what it meant to look his brothers in arms in the eye and know they could trust him with their lives. He wasn't going to come home and throw all of that away. Not even for his freedom. Pete nodded slowly. Then he said something that Joe would remember for the rest of his life. He said that Joe might have lost his wife, lost his home, lost his freedom, but he hadn't lost himself, and sometimes that's all a man's got left. They talked for a few more minutes. Pete promised to check in on Joe, said he'd put some money on his commissary account, said he'd be there if Joe needed anything. Then visiting hours ended. Pete stood up, placed his hand against the glass. Joe did the same on his side. Then Pete put his cap back on and walked away. Joe was escorted back to his cell. That night, lying on the thin mattress in his cell, Joe stared at the ceiling. Somewhere across the city, Ruby was in a hospital bed, Alive, recovering, probably scared, probably confused. Marcus was in the morgue, dead at 28 because he'd pulled a gun in the wrong bedroom. And Joe was here, waiting for a trial that would decide the rest of his life. But Pete's words echoed in his mind. He hadn't lost himself. 2 days later, the district attorney filed formal charges. Attempted murder in the second degree for the shooting of Ruby Benson. Voluntary manslaughter for the death of Marcus Deshaun Williams, reduced from murder due to the circumstances. If convicted on both counts, Joe was looking at 15 to 25 years. The investigation continued. Detectives interviewed neighbors, pulled phone records, examined Ruby's medical history, confirming the drug use she'd mentioned. Found text messages between Ruby and Marcus, some tender, some threatening, painting a complicated picture of their relationship. They pulled Joe's service records, exemplary, 3 commendations, a Bronze Star, recommendation for promotion, not a single disciplinary action in 15 years of service. Character witnesses lined up, his commanding officer, fellow soldiers, even Pete, who barely knew him but insisted he was a good man who'd made a terrible choice in a terrible moment. And then Ruby made another statement. From her hospital bed, still recovering from surgery, Ruby told investigators she didn't want to press charges. She understood what Joe had done, understood why. She'd betrayed him, destroyed their marriage, put him in an impossible situation. She said Joe wasn't a criminal. He was a soldier who'd been pushed past his breaking point. She begged the district attorney to show mercy. The district attorney's office released a statement. While they appreciated Mrs. Benson's position, the state had an obligation to prosecute violent crimes. This wasn't a domestic dispute. This was attempted murder and manslaughter. The case would proceed. Joe's public defender, an overworked woman named Amanda Chen with too many cases and not enough time, came to see him. She laid out his options. Plead guilty, accept a deal, probably get 12 to 15 years with good behavior, out in 10 if he was lucky. Or go to trial, fight it, hope for jury sympathy, but risk the full 25 if they found him guilty on all counts. She asked what he wanted to do. Joe asked what she recommended. Amanda was honest. She said the evidence was overwhelming. His own confession sealed the deal. Their best hope was to argue extreme emotional disturbance, PTSD from his deployment, diminished capacity, paint him as a victim of circumstance, not a cold-blooded killer. It might work, it might not. Joe asked if Ruby would have to testify. Amanda said yes. If they went to trial, the prosecution would call her, and so would they. Her testimony could help or hurt, depending on what she said. Joe thought about Ruby having to relive that night in front of a courtroom, thought about her on the witness stand, describing what her husband had done to her. He told Amanda he'd think about it. That night, Joe had his first nightmare since coming home, but it wasn't about Iraq, wasn't about roadside bombs or firefights or watching his brothers die. It was about the bedroom, the yellow lamplight, the gun in his hand, Ruby's eyes, the shot, over and over and over. He woke up screaming. The guard came to check on him, asked if he was okay. Joe nodded, wiping sweat from his face. The guard left. Joe sat on his bunk, head in his hands. He'd survived 15 months in Iraq without a single nightmare. But 2 days home had given him enough to last a lifetime. 3 weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings, court appearances, and the mind-numbing routine of jail life. Joe spent most of his time alone, reading books Pete brought him, writing letters he never sent, and thinking about the choice he had to make. Amanda Chen pushed for the plea deal, 12 years. With good behavior, he'd be out in 9. He was 35 now. He'd be 44, still young enough to have a life after. But something in Joe resisted, not because he thought he was innocent. He knew exactly what he'd done, but because taking the plea felt like running, and Joe had never been a runner. On a gray Thursday morning in late July, Amanda came to see him with news. Ruby had been released from the hospital. She was staying with her sister on the South Side, and she'd reached out through her own lawyer. She wanted to see Joe, face to face. Amanda advised against it. Anything Joe said could be used against him. Ruby might be wearing a wire. The prosecution could twist it into an admission of guilt or lack of remorse. But Joe said yes anyway. The meeting was arranged for the following Tuesday. A private room in the jail, supervised but not recorded, as per an agreement between the attorneys. Ruby's lawyer would be present. So would Amanda. Joe didn't sleep the night before. When they brought him into the room, Ruby was already there. She sat in a plastic chair, her left arm in a sling, her face thinner than he remembered, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup. She looked up when he entered, and Joe saw tears immediately spring to her eyes. The lawyers sat on opposite ends of the room. Joe and Ruby sat across from each other at a small table. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ruby broke the silence. Her voice was small, shaky. She said she was sorry. She'd said it before in the hospital in her statements, but she needed to tell it to his face. She was sorry for everything, for the affair, for the drugs, for bringing Marcus into their home, for destroying everything they'd built. Joe listened without interrupting. Ruby continued. She said she'd been lost while he was gone. The loneliness had eaten at her until she'd started looking for anything to fill the void. Pills helped at first. Then they weren't enough. Marcus had seemed like an escape, someone who made her feel wanted, alive. But it had all been a lie, a terrible, destructive lie. She looked at her arm in the sling. She said she didn't blame Joe for what he'd done. She blamed herself. If she'd been honest, if she'd gotten help, if she'd been the wife he deserved, none of this would have happened. Joe finally spoke. His voice was rough from disuse. He told her that what she did was wrong, unforgivable maybe, but what he did was wrong too. He'd shot her, not in the heat of the moment with Marcus, but after, in cold blood. He'd made that choice. And he had to live with it. Ruby wiped tears from her face. She said she'd been talking to the DA, begging them to drop the charges, but they wouldn't listen. They said the state had to prosecute. But she'd found another way. She told Joe she'd been meeting with a veterans advocacy group, lawyers who specialize in PTSD cases. They believed they could mount a strong defense, combat stress, diminished capacity. A soldier who'd been trained to respond with lethal force was suddenly thrust into an impossible situation. They wanted to take Joe's case, pro bono. Amanda Chen sat forward, suddenly interested. She asked Ruby's lawyer about this. Who were these attorneys? What firm? Ruby's lawyer provided the information. It was legitimate. A well-respected group that had won several high-profile cases involving veterans. But there was a condition. Joe would have to testify, would have to talk about Iraq, about what he'd seen, what he'd done, what it had cost him psychologically. He'd have to admit he wasn't okay when he came home, that he was suffering from untreated PTSD. He'd have to be vulnerable in front of a courtroom full of strangers. Joe looked at Ruby. He asked why. Why was she doing this? He'd tried to kill her. Why was she trying to save him? Ruby's answer came quietly, but with absolute certainty. She said because he'd saved her first, not that night before, when they'd met, when they'd married. He'd given her purpose, given her love, given her the best 10 years of her life. She'd destroyed it, but that didn't mean she wanted to see him spend the rest of his life in prison. She said she owed him this. It was the least she could do. Joe sat back in his chair. He looked at Amanda, who nodded slightly. It was a good offer, better than the plea deal. If this veterans group was as good as their reputation, they had a real chance. He looked back at Ruby. He asked what would happen to her, to them. Ruby's smile was sad, broken. She said there was no them anymore, too much damage, too much pain. When this was over, however it ended, she was moving to Atlanta to live with her sister, start over, get clean, really clean this time. She said she hoped Joe could forgive her someday, but she understood if he never could. Joe nodded slowly. He told her he'd take the help. He'd fight the charges, not because he thought he deserved to walk free, but because maybe, just maybe, the truth of what happened, the full truth, deserved to be heard. Ruby reached across the table. For a moment, Joe thought she wanted to hold his hand, but instead she placed something on the table between them. It was the velvet box, the gold necklace from Dubai. Their initials are engraved on the back. She'd kept it. She told him to sell it if he needed money for commissary, or keep it as a reminder that they'd once been something beautiful, before it all fell apart. Then she stood up. The meeting was over. Joe watched her walk to the door, her lawyer supporting her injured arm. She turned back once, gave him a small, sad smile, and then she was gone. Amanda Chen moved to sit where Ruby had been. She picked up the velvet box, examined it, then set it back down. She asked Joe if he was sure about this. Going to trial was a risk, a big risk. Joe said he was sure. The trial began 3 months later in October. The courthouse was packed. Local news cameras, reporters, veteran advocacy groups holding signs outside. Support our soldiers. PTSD is real. Justice for Joe Benson. The prosecution painted Joe as a man who'd snapped, who'd come home and committed a brutal act of vengeance, who'd killed one man and attempted to kill his own wife in a jealous rage. The defense painted a different picture. A decorated soldier, 15 months of combat, inadequate mental health support, a man who'd been trained to respond to threats with immediate, lethal force, who'd walked into a situation that triggered every survival instinct he'd developed in Iraq. Joe testified for 6 hours over 2 days. He talked about things he'd never spoken about, not to Ruby, not to his commanding officers, not to anyone. He talked about watching his best friend die from an IED, about the firefight where he'd killed 3 insurgents at close range, about the child who'd approached their convoy wearing a suicide vest, about the nightmares he'd had over there that he'd convinced himself would stop when he came home. He talked about the moment he'd opened that bedroom door, how his brain had stopped seeing Ruby and a man, how it had only seen threats, targets, enemies. He talked about the split second when his training overrode everything else. And then he talked about after, about the moment when clarity had returned, when he'd realized what he'd done, when he'd chosen to tell the truth instead of taking the easy way out. The prosecutor cross-examined him ruthlessly, pointed out that he'd had time to call 911, time to walk away, time to make a different choice before firing that second shot. Joe didn't deny it. He admitted all of it, said the prosecutor was right. In that moment he'd made a choice driven by rage and betrayal, not training, not PTSD. Rage. The courtroom went silent. Even his own lawyers looked stunned. Joe had just undermined his entire defense. But then Joe said something else, something that hadn't been in any of his prepared testimony. He said that coming home from war you carry 2 people inside you, the person you were before, and the soldier you became. Most days the person you were stays in control, but some days, some moments, the soldier takes over. And the soldier doesn't think about consequences, doesn't think about mercy. The soldier only thinks about survival, about eliminating threats. He said he wasn't asking the jury to excuse what he'd done. He was asking them to understand how it happened, to understand that when you train someone to kill, when you put them through 15 months of hell, when you teach them that hesitation means death, you can't expect them to just turn it off the moment they get home. He said the military had failed him, not with training, not with equipment, but with the transition back, by helping him process what he'd experienced, by teaching him how to be a husband again instead of a soldier. And he said he'd failed himself. By not asking for help, by thinking he could just push through it, by believing that being strong meant suffering in silence. The courtroom remained silent as Joe finished. He looked at the jury, 7 women, 5 men, a mix of ages and backgrounds, and told them that whatever they decided, he'd accept it. He'd told the truth, that's all he could do. Ruby testified next. She corroborated everything Joe had said about Marcus, about the drugs, about the threats. She admitted to the affair, admitted to her addiction, took full responsibility for setting the events in motion. Then the prosecutor asked her the critical question. Did she believe her husband had intended to kill her? Ruby looked at Joe. Their eyes met across the courtroom. She said no. She believed Joe had been out of his mind with trauma and rage. She believed that if he truly wanted her dead, with his military training, she would be. She said the man who shot her wasn't the man she'd married. It was someone else, someone the war had created. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Closing arguments were passionate on both sides. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they filed back into the courtroom, Joe stood between his attorneys. Ruby sat in the gallery, her sister beside her. Pete was there too, in his cab driver's cap, sitting in the back row. The judge asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The foreman stood, an older black man, a Vietnam veteran himself, based on the cap he'd worn to court every day. He said they had. On the charge of attempted murder in the 2nd degree for the shooting of Ruby Benson, not guilty. On the charge of voluntary manslaughter for the death of Marcus Deshaun Williams, guilty. The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order. Joe stood frozen, trying to process what he just heard. Not guilty of trying to kill Ruby, but guilty of killing Marcus. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Joe's attorneys immediately filed for leniency based on the circumstances. Character witnesses testified. His commanding officer, fellow soldiers, even Ruby pleading for mercy. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judith Martinez, listened to everything. Then she delivered her sentence. For the voluntary manslaughter of Marcus Deshaun Williams, 6 years in state prison, with credit for time served. Eligible for parole in 4 years with good behavior. It was more than the defense had hoped for, less than the prosecution had wanted. Joe would serve time, but not the 15 to 25 he'd been facing. The judge explained her reasoning. She said Joe had committed a serious crime. A man was dead. That couldn't be ignored, but the circumstances were extraordinary. The PTSD was real. The provocation was extreme. And Joe's honesty, his refusal to hide behind easier lies, showed character. She said she hoped Joe would use his time in prison to heal, to get the help he should have gotten when he came home from Iraq. Joe was transferred to Stateville Correctional Center the following week, a medium security facility about an hour outside Chicago. He was assigned to a cell, given a work detail in the prison library, and enrolled in the mental health program. For the first time since coming home, Joe started therapy, real therapy, with a psychologist who specialized in combat trauma. They talked about Iraq, about the things Joe had seen and done, about the guilt he carried, about the anger. It was hard, harder than any firefight, harder than any deployment, because it meant facing things Joe had spent years trying to bury. But slowly, very slowly, he started to heal. Ruby kept her word. She moved to Atlanta, got into a residential treatment program, got clean, started rebuilding her life piece by piece. She wrote to Joe every few weeks, not romantic letters, not trying to rebuild their marriage. Just updates, letting him know she was okay, that she was fighting her own battles. Joe wrote back, short letters, cordial, wishing her well. The divorce papers came 6 months into his sentence. Joe signed them without hesitation. Their marriage had died in that bedroom. The paperwork was just making it official. Pete visited every month, like clockwork, brought books, brought stories from the city, brought a connection to the outside world that reminded Joe he was still human. They played chess on opposite sides of the plexiglass. Pete was terrible at it, but he kept playing anyway. 2 years into his sentence, Joe was granted parole board review for good behavior. His lawyers petitioned. His therapist wrote a recommendation. Ruby wrote a letter of support from Atlanta. The parole board met in a small room. 5 people who would decide if Joe Benson had been rehabilitated, if he deserved a second chance. They asked him about remorse, about what he'd learned, about his plans if released. Joe was honest. He said he'd never stop regretting what he'd done. Marcus Deshaun Williams was dead because of him. Ruby would carry physical and emotional scars for the rest of her life. Those were facts he had to live with. But he'd also learned something in prison. He'd learned that acknowledging your darkness doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. He'd learned that asking for help isn't failure. It's survival. And he'd learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying your past without letting it destroy your future. The parole board deliberated for 20 minutes. Then they granted his release. On a cold morning in November, 3.5 years after that July night when he'd come home from Iraq, Joe Benson walked out of Stateville Correctional Center. He wore donated civilian clothes, carried a plastic bag with his few possessions, and stepped into the parking lot as a free man. Pete was waiting for him, leaning against his cab. Same old cab, same old cap. Joe walked over and Pete pulled him into a hug, a real hug, the kind Joe hadn't had in years. Pete asked where Joe wanted to go. Joe didn't have an answer. He had no home, no job, no family. Ruby was in Atlanta, living her own life. The house on Stony Island had been sold to cover legal fees. But he had something. A referral to a veteran's halfway house on the north side. A promise of a job at a veterans center, helping other soldiers transition home. A chance to turn his pain into purpose. Joe told Pete the address. Pete nodded, opened the passenger door, and Joe got in. Not the back seat this time. The front, like equals, like friends. As they pulled out of the parking lot, Joe looked back at the prison one last time. 3.5 years of his life. Gone, but not wasted. He'd lost everything. His wife, his freedom, his future as he'd imagined it. But he'd found something too. The truth about himself. About what he was capable of, both the darkness and the light. Pete turned on the radio. Some old blues station. They drove in comfortable silence through the gray Illinois morning. After a while, Joe spoke. He thanked Pete for everything, the visits, the money, the books, for being there when no one else was. Pete waved it off, said that's what people do. They show up, especially when it's hard. Joe looked out the window at the passing landscape. Bare trees, gray sky, the beginning of winter. He thought about Ruby in Atlanta. Hoped she was okay. Hoped she'd found some peace. He thought about Marcus, about a life cut short, about choices that couldn't be undone. He thought about Iraq, about the soldiers he'd served with, about the ones who didn't make it home. And he thought about the future, uncertain, difficult but possible. He'd come home from war once before. It had destroyed him. Now he was coming home again. This time he'd be ready. Pete asked if he was hungry. Joe realized he was, starving actually. Pete said he knew a place. Best pancakes in Chicago, his treat. Joe smiled, his first real smile in 3.5 years. He said pancakes sounded perfect. The cab merged onto the highway, heading north toward the city, toward uncertainty, toward redemption, toward whatever came next. Staff Sergeant Joe Benson had survived Iraq. He'd survived betrayal. He'd survived prison. Now he just had to survive coming home. But this time he wouldn't do it alone. And maybe, just maybe, that would make all the difference. If you liked this story, please show us by liking and subscribing to this channel. It goes a long way in helping us bring you more crime stories daily. Also, comment the time and location where you are watching from. I'm so curious to know. I want to know what you feel about this story in the comments.